One of the funniest films of the year. I laughed my head off. Sneak previews. It's gratifying, raunchy, and uproarious. The Nerds Triumph. Los Angeles Times. It's really, really funny. I was rolling on the floor, as did all the other members of the audience. KHJTV, Los Angeles. And USA Today says this is great stuff. 3 cheers for Nerds.
I'd blink through that.
Revenge of the Nerds. Rated R. Check newspapers for theaters.
Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is a review of the 1984 comedy Revenge of the Nerds. Now, before I get into sharing my thoughts on this film, I want to give a shout out to Brock for requesting this review, as well as for requesting reviews of all of the other Revenge of the Nerds movies. And if there is a particular film you'd like to hear me review, or a topic you'd like to hear me discuss, or a TV show you'd like to hear my thoughts on, or an anime, feel free to donate to my PayPal. The link will be in the video description. Now, Revenge of the Nerds is one of those films that I'd heard about. I had seen bits and pieces of it on cable growing up. I do remember catching the infamous moon room scene when I was fairly young on Comedy Central. But it really didn't leave that much of an impression on me. So I was not one of those people that was really big on the film. Like, I didn't grow up with this movie at all. This is actually the first time I saw it all the way through, was for my most recent viewing of the film for this review. Now, I will say this, and I will definitely acknowledge this at some point in this review, in terms of its problematic nature, in terms of certain sequences and certain aspects of the plot. But I'll save that for a little bit later, because I think it is something that definitely should be discussed when it comes to talking about this movie. But I also feel that there's a lot of legitimately progressive and good things about this film that I definitely do not feel should be ignored due to its problematic nature when it comes to certain scenes. Instead of judging the entire film as being bad or being dated or not holding up, judge it based on a combination of parts, not just individual parts that really don't hold up to today's standards. So the film is directed by Jeff Kanew, and prior to this, he didn't do a whole lot. He did a few films here and there, but it wasn't like he was a really well-known director. He did Eddie Macon's Run, and some other TV work, and some other low-budget films. Jeff's direction here, it's serviceable. It's nothing spectacular. But then again, with this kind of film, I don't think it was really going to have some really stellar direction in terms of the style or the type of camera work that is on display, or even the cinematography. A lot of these lower budgeted teen comedies from the 80s tended to look very similar, and didn't really blow you away when it comes to their visual style. But that being said, it's a decent enough job when it comes to the direction, and it's not like it's a project that really has a lot that a director can work with in terms of having an avenue for more creative shots, like pans and different sort of angles, like Dutch angles and so on and so forth. It's one of those films that just has a consistent look and presentation throughout, and I think that's also intentional, because you don't want it to be too distracting. You don't want to have some auteur director come in and try to make a teen comedy more fancy than it needs to be when it comes to the direction. It features a screenplay by Steve Zacharias and Jeff Buhai. This script is a mixed bag. I like how it writes some of the characters, um, at least for the most part. I like how Louis Skolnick and Gilbert and Poindexter and Booger and Lamar are written. The villains, Stan Gable, Danny, Ogre, they are fine. They definitely are written in ways that you really get to despise them as the film goes on. So it is one of those things where the screenwriters did a good job making them loathsome villains, but they definitely didn't have that much depth, especially compared to the nerds, who were, in all honesty, the main focus of the film. And for the time period, having the focus of a film like this be on the outcasts, on the nerds, was genuinely progressive. It was ahead of its time. Nowadays, it's something we see all the time. It's commonplace. But back in 1984, the nerds usually were losers. The nerds were not the ones that were getting their own film. The nerds were not the ones that were getting the upper hand on the jocks. They were the ones that were getting bullied and poked at and made fun of. And so it was really refreshing to see the nerds get their due and to get their day in the sun. Even though really their day in the sun happens more in the sequel than it does in the first film. But figuratively, yeah, it was their day in the sun. It was their time to shine. And it sparked a lot of films that were trying to recapture this same kind of success of these outcasts, these nerds who are downtrodden and looked down upon, and they eventually are the ones that win in the end. And that's something that's so familiar nowadays. But back in 1984, it wasn't. It really was not a familiar plot line. It did not happen that often. After Revenge of the Nerds, you saw this kind of idea all the time. But prior to Revenge of the Nerds, this was actually pretty unique. And speaking of unique, I do feel there are a lot of moments of genuine creativity with this screenplay. How the nerds provide their take on a raunchy sex comedy. How they use their intelligence to get the upper hand in the competition in the last 30 minutes or so. Like where Takashi is given this formula that makes it so he doesn't get drunk even though he's drinking all this beer. So that gives him an upper hand when it comes to the bicycle race. Um, Other things like with Lamar's character, he has this limp wristed throwing motion, so they create this javelin that enables him to be able to throw it really far despite his throwing motion. And I understand, yes, that is a little bit too much of a gay stereotype in terms of the limp wrist and everything, and I do feel that that could have been handled a little bit differently. But at the same time, it's not like it's just there as a cheap gag because Lamar actually wins. Lavar, I think is his name. I think Lamar. Is it Lavelle? I think that's who it is. No, it is Lamar. It is Lamar Latrell. So Lamar actually wins. He wins the javelin competition. So I don't think it's all bad. Um, that being said, though, it does reveal one of the script's bigger flaws is how it portrays certain characters. For instance, Takashi, who's played by the voice of Leonardo from the 90s Ninja Turtles movies, Brian Tochi. And he he's just a giant Asian stereotype with the thick accent, and you don't understand what he's saying, and the jokes about how you can't understand what he's saying, and that's really all the character was, except for maybe one or two scenes. So I feel that was very lazy on the screenwriter's part, and that definitely is not held up very well in terms of the interpretation that they were going with the character of Takashi. Uh, and with someone like Lamar, for the most part, I think it's actually really progressive for the time. Not only is it a gay teen character, it's also a African American. That kind of dual representation was not very commonplace. And so I do feel that the screenplay and the screenwriters do deserve some credit for having a character like that in the film. But there were some moments where they did go for some low-hanging fruit in terms of the uh, homosexuality jokes and stuff like that. Um, but really, where the film is hurt the most, other than some aspects of the climax being a little disappointing, or the love story that the screenwriters come up with for Lewis and Betty. It really is those two sequences that are talked about a lot nowadays when it comes to the film. Uh, the sorority house security camera scene and the infamous moon room rape sequence. These are all things that the director and the writer who they have these are all things that the director and writer have actually come out and said that they regretted. So they've learned from it. They have acknowledged that it really was not the best approach. And if you're going to talk about things about this film that don't hold up and have not aged well compared to today's standards, those two scenes are the pinnacle or the peak of problematic when it comes to this particular film. And I'm no prude, but I was really uncomfortable watching the security camera sorority house sequence. I did not feel that that was really a necessary direction that they needed to go in. They could have come up with some other way to get back at the girls instead of invading their privacy like that. Uh, it took the peephole to a whole other level, and it was just really uncomfortable to watch. I didn't find it funny. I just thought it was really just uncomfortable. And yeah, it's nice to see some TNA, but if I want that, I can watch a porn. And it also didn't seem like it fit with the characters, that they would really go that far. It seemed, and that's really something I felt was very off with this film, is the tone. Most of the film is a lighthearted teen comedy, and then it's some raunchy R-rated sex comedy. And the raunchy R-rated sex comedy aspects of the film, they don't really mesh that well with the teen, lighthearted, silly aspects of the overall story. Um, they really do stand out, and I don't necessarily think they stand out in a good way. I guess it's probably because I'm not really the biggest fan of the raunchy sex comedy. I can watch it, it's okay, but I really feel that a lot of it just relies upon the raunch and sex, and the comedy seems to be second or third. It just seems like it really, a lot of these films seem to be excuses for just TNA. And, there's a time and place for that, but it just, I just don't feel that these raunchy sex comedy aspects really worked with the overall characters, the way that they were written, and with the plot line. It just seemed like something that was way out of left field. And I felt that the film was dramatically affected because of that aspect of it. I just thought it was ultimately a decent, okay time waster to me because of these other really seedy kind of skeevy aspects of it that just, to me, just make me too uncomfortable to be entertained by them. The moon room scene where Lewis disguises himself as Stan to get into Betty's pants, and he acts like he's Stan, but she doesn't know that he's not Stan. So they make out and they have sex, and a lot of critics and a lot of people pointed out that today that really does seem like it's implied rape, and it is a really rough scene to sit through. I don't think it really needed to be in the film, and also I don't think it really established the love interest that well. It was very clunky and forced because just because Lewis was good in bed and better than Stan, now you want to be his girlfriend. There was no build up. There was no natural progression in terms of Betty and Lewis being a couple. And uh, when you get to the point by the end of the film where she's all like, "I'm in love with a nerd," it's like, it doesn't really work because there wasn't enough time between those two to establish a genuine connection. And I do agree with some critics when it comes to that scene really relaying a pretty bad message about, oh, you can rape a woman without her consent because she thinks you're someone else, and then if you do a good job in bed, she'll be your girlfriend. It's like, ugh! It really, that really does not hold up. Um, but there are other aspects of the script that are mixed in terms of their effectiveness. The whole competition, the relay between different factions of the college, it was pretty predictable, pretty one note. Um, it was enjoyable enough, but it just was one of those things where you saw where it was going to wind up because of films like Meatballs and so on and so forth. And I don't really care for the ending. It's anticlimactic. These nerds, they get their chance to show that they belong. They win the competition, and the jocks retaliate by destroying their house. And the jocks then try to say one last word and continue to bully the nerds, and then the nerds stand up, but they don't really get into any kind of physical confrontation. They just say some words, and then "We Are the Champions" plays, and that's it. And I was like, I wanted to see the jocks get more of a comeuppance in the end. They had some pranks that were done on them, like the burning cream that was put in their jock straps and so on and so forth. But I wanted to see in the end some actual comeuppance, whether they get expelled, they get banned, they get arrested, something, they get beat up by the other members of Lambda. But no, that's not what happens at all, so it's a little bit of a letdown in that regard. But the script does have its moments when it comes to the lighthearted, fun stuff. And the characterizations and some lines of dialogue. One of my favorite, probably my favorite line of dialogue from Revenge of the Nerds is this line from Booger. And I'm just going to find it real quick. Um, and it's not even like the most original line of dialogue, but I find it to be absolutely hilarious because of Curtis Armstrong's delivery. So Stan Gable is calling out a nerd and Booger, and he's like, "What are you looking at, nerd?" And Booger's like, "I thought I was looking at my mother's old douchebag, but that's in Ohio." It's just the way he said it. It just cracks me up. Um, and there's some fun stuff. I mean, I really like the musical number that the nerds have at the end. Very Mark Mothersbaugh, definitely inspired by Devo. And it does have its heart in the right place, despite its controversial sequences. And I think that's a big reason why this screenplay and this overall plot should not be considered entirely problematic, because it does have a good message in the end of standing up for yourself and being true to who you are, and not being afraid of backlash, and giving the outcast, the nerd, a chance to shine. I really do feel that that is a great message, and I feel the film does a good job displaying that message, despite some moments where it runs into a couple speed bumps along the way. So the film also features a score by Thomas Newman. Thomas Newman's a pretty well-known composer, but I wouldn't say this is one of his best scores. The film's strengths when it comes to the soundtrack are really in the original songs for the soundtrack, like "Are You Ready" by Yaya, which honestly is one of the catchiest songs you will ever hear in your entire life. Are You Ready for the Sex Girls? Apparently, they really liked Are You Ready when it comes to songs for the soundtrack. Um, the bit of music that was composed for the nerds and their talent show performance, and some genuine classic songs like "We Are the Champions" by Queen, and "Burning Down the House" by Talking Heads, and "Thriller" by Michael Jackson. And the main theme song, "Revenge of the Nerds" by the Rubinos, which I mentioned Mark Mothersbaugh and Devo, and the Rubinos 100% were trying to be as close to Devo as they could possibly be with that song. Uh, and other stuff like "One Foot in Front of the Other" by Bone Symphony, which is played during the montage when they are cleaning up the abandoned house that they purchased to make it into a fraternity house. Because that's another thing I did like about the script, is why the nerds had to find their own fraternity, because they were staying in the freshman uh, building, but the jocks, uh, the alpha betas, they had this wild party one night, and one guy wound up lighting the entire fraternity on fire because he's messing around with fireball and a lighter. And I thought that was actually pretty funny. And then they wind up taking the freshman house and kick the nerds out, and then the nerds are staying in the gymnasium, and all they have is like this really old black and white TV in terms of entertainment. I So there is some creativity in that regard too when it comes to the screenplay. So but yeah, music wise, I actually like a good number of songs from the soundtrack. I would say my favorite song though is probably "Are You Ready." Um, like I said, the other technical aspects, they are adequate enough. The cinematography by King Baggett, the editing by Alan Balsam. Uh, but other than some of the aspects of the screenplay in terms of the way the characters are written, uh, some of the dialogue, some of the situations that they wind up in, the biggest strength, arguably, is the cast. Robert Carradine as Lewis, Anthony Edwards as Gilbert. I grew up watching Top Gun, so seeing Anthony Edwards in this kind of role, it was honestly a bit of a shock, because I was used to him playing a completely different type of character. So it was nice to see him in a role like this where he was playing a character that wasn't cool, but at the same time, by the end of it, had his own form of coolness. Uh, See, this film actually does a remarkable job as well of finding a way to make these nerdy characters legitimately cool in their own way versus other films in the franchise where it's just lame. So I definitely feel that this is one of the best examples of a film that stars nerds and they are the focus of the film, but through their own quirky eccentricities and different unique personalities, they do find a way to become endearing and genuinely cool. And I also think that's a big reason why this film was such a success in the mainstream, was because people who weren't nerds could enjoy the film and have fun with it. And the jocks probably watched it and got some laughs and ultimately thought the nerds were kind of cool in the end. But yeah, Robert Carradine, Anthony Edwards, Timothy Busfield as Poindexter. His physical comedy in this is a highlight. I crack up every time when he's stumbling around and being barely unable to even walk in a straight line. And the reason for that is because the glasses he was wearing were so thick he couldn't fucking see. So a lot of that isn't even necessarily Timothy Busfield acting. A lot of it's just him dealing with what he was given in terms of these massive prescription lenses. Andrew Cassese is Wormser, one of the weakest characters in the film, other than Takashi. I didn't really care for Wormser that much. Curtis Armstrong almost steals the entire movie as Booger. Uh, you can see why he became a instant favorite among audiences when the film was released, and when the film came out on home video. Larry B. Scott as Lamar. He does such a genuinely uh, realistic portrayal for the most part of a gay man that it's really hard to believe that he is straight. But that just goes to show you how good of a performance Larry gave to this role. And yes, you could argue that maybe it should have gone to somebody who actually was gay, but in this time period, that wasn't very common due to the way society was. And this was still something that was really progressive and really did put not necessarily the best foot forward, but at least a foot forward in the right direction when it comes to representation of homosexuals in the media. There are some moments, like I said, where it stumbles a little bit and the script relies a little bit too much on the cliched stereotypes, but there are other moments where he's painted as a character that is genuinely able to stand on his own. And I definitely feel that that is something that should be mentioned. And honestly, should be mentioned more often. Uh, and so should Larry's performance. He really brought a lot of energy to it and had a lot of fun with the role. And the villains, they did a good job too. I mean, Ted McGinley, I would say this is one of his best performances as Stan Gable. I really wanted to punch him in the face. I did not like him, but that's the point. But he also wasn't the type of villain that I hated to the point where I didn't even want to watch him anymore. Like, I wanted to punch him in the face, but I still enjoyed his scenes because of what Ted McGinley uh, brought to the table. Julia Montgomery, she was fine as Betty. Like I said, her relationship with Lewis didn't really work, and I don't even think that's really her fault. That's a screenwriting issue. Donald Gibb as Ogre. I love Donald Gibb, and I love him in this role. Uh, James Cromwell as Mr. Skolnick, the father. He only had like a couple scenes, but he made the most out of them. And apparently he's the one that's to blame for that annoying nerd laugh that I'm not even going to try to do because I don't even think I can accomplish it. And yeah, I could see why audiences at the time found it to be funny, but I could also see why audiences at the time and to this day find it to be annoying and obnoxious. Thankfully, the nerd laugh is not a constant throughout the movie. And you also had John Goodman as Coach Harris, this asshole coach who's just a big bully, and it was really quite a shocker to see John Goodman in one of his earlier roles. I was not expecting John Goodman to be in this movie, so it was a welcome surprise to see him, as well as Bernie Casey as UN Jefferson. But yeah, for the most part, a really good cast, and definitely one of the brightest spots about the film. At the end of the day, I had fun with the film. I thought it was okay. I thought it was a decent time waster. I actually prefer the sequel more, and I will talk about that more when I cover that film. But I do feel it's a movie, though, that if you're a fan of 80s teen comedies or 80s sex comedies, I definitely would recommend giving it a watch. And if you do see it and you haven't seen it before, go into it with an open mind and judge it based on the entirety of the story. Don't just judge it based on the problematic aspects of the story. That's not fair to what they were trying to do. It's not fair to the screenwriters. It's not fair to the other people that were involved with the film when it comes to the production. So I think there should be a discussion about what's acceptable nowadays versus what is not, but I don't feel that the entire film needs to be considered problematic. And I feel that a lot of that is going on when it comes to criticisms of this movie. And I think that's, no pun intended, pretty problematic in itself. Because it's not really providing the full story, and it's not providing a complete voice for the filmmakers and the writers and everyone else involved with a film like this to the forefront. It's not giving them their opportunity to defend themselves and then try to defend the merits of the film and to really provide context. That's another thing. You got to understand the context of things. You got to understand that back in 1984, sensibilities were a lot different than they are today. It doesn't necessarily excuse them entirely, but it explains why certain representations and why certain approaches were so common and were so prevalent, and why a screenwriter would just write something like that and really not think that much of it until years later when sensibilities and standards shift. So it's just one of those things where it is a product of its time, and you really need to take that into account. And I think if you do, I do feel that there is some enjoyment to be had with the film. So anyway, that's my thoughts on Revenge of the Nerds. And as always, I'll see you later. See ya.